The billionaire CEO slapped the shy, older waitress, then froze when she calmly asked if he wanted her to call her father's name. The hush that fell over the dining room was so complete it felt physical, as if someone had pressed a giant invisible pause button. Forks hovered mid-air. A server in the corner stopped pouring wine halfway through a glass. Even the soft piano music drifting from the speaker system seemed to retreat into its own silence. Chandeliers glowed above them, warm and golden, casting reflections across polished marble floors and crystal-clear water glasses. Everything looked elegant, controlled, orderly, until the moment the CEO's hand rose. The entire restaurant watched the shape of his palm through the air like a slow-motion scene in a courtroom drama. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. But the slap never landed. Evelyn Carter, 61 years old, with tired eyes and a lifetime of quiet resilience behind them, lifted her hand and stopped his palm an inch from her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her black and white uniform was simple, pressed neatly. Her hair was pinned in a modest bun. She looked like the last person in the world who would provoke a man like him. And yet she stood there, steady as a pillar. Across the room, a man in a navy suit dropped his jaw slightly, stunned. Another diner straightened in his chair, no longer pretending not to stare. Everyone could feel the electric shift in the room. The CEO, tall, well-groomed, radiating the entitlement that came from years of boardrooms and power, seethed. His voice had cut through the air moments earlier, accusing Evelyn of taking a silver pen from his table. She had barely opened her mouth to explain before he grabbed her wrist and tried to strike her. Now, with his hand held frozen mid-air by the most unexpected woman in the restaurant, his confidence cracked. "That's enough," Evelyn said, her voice soft, almost maternal, yet sharper than any shout could have been. "If you truly believe I took something, sir, would you like me to call my father's name right now?" The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The entire dining room heard them as clearly as if she had spoken through a microphone. The CEO blinked, confusion flashing across his features. He tried to reclaim his composure, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Around him, the witnesses watched, waiting not for him to respond, but to see what would happen to him. Evelyn gently lowered his hand from hers, not breaking eye contact. For a second, she looked like the only person in the room who wasn't afraid of him. He swallowed. "Who exactly is your father?" Evelyn didn't answer. Not yet. She simply stepped back, smoothing the front of her apron, returning to the stillness that framed her like a portrait. But the question hung above the tables like a storm cloud. Behind her composure was a life built on grit and grace. She had raised 2 children while working double shifts. She had survived a failing heart, medical bills, and a landlord who never fixed the heat in her tiny Queens apartment. Every morning she practiced gratitude. Every night, responsibility. She believed in kindness, in patience, in dignity, even when others did not show it to her. But she also carried something most people didn't know, a name she never used unless she had to, a name powerful enough to pull the ground out from under a man like the CEO standing in front of her. "You accused the wrong person," she said quietly. Several diners exchanged glances. One whispered, "She's not bluffing." The CEO forced a laugh, thin and shaky. "You think calling your father is going to help you? Who is he, some lawyer?" Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear the first half of her answer. "Would you like me to speak louder and let the entire room hear?" The color drained from his face, and then for the first time since he'd walked into the restaurant he took a step back. Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The balance of the entire room had shifted with one calm sentence. The diners waited, breath held, eyes glued to the quiet, older woman who had just undone a billionaire with nothing more than her composure and a name he clearly feared. Evelyn finally exhaled softly, her voice carrying across the silent dining hall. Please reconsider your accusation, sir, before I make that call. The CEO's hand dropped to his side. The room stayed frozen, and for the first time, the man who thought he owned the room realized he no longer controlled anything at all. The dining room remained painfully silent as the CEO stood frozen in front of Evelyn, still trying to process how the older waitress he had just tried to strike could command so much quiet authority with nothing more than a sentence, and the tension in the air thickened as the surrounding diners leaned in, pretending to sip their wine while their eyes stayed glued to the unfolding confrontation. Although Evelyn's voice was gentle, there was a steadiness beneath it that carried the weight of someone who had survived difficult winters, unfair bosses, unexpected bills, and years of quiet sacrifice, and that unwavering composure unsettled the CEO far more than any raised voice ever could, because power like his was used to fear not dignity. "Ma'am," he finally muttered, trying to gather his pride, "this is unnecessary. If there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it without theatrics." Yet the slight tremble in his words betrayed how badly he wanted to regain control of the moment slipping through his fingers. Evelyn didn't move, didn't blink, didn't soften. Instead, she looked at him with a calm so firm it felt like a verdict, and several guests exchanged glances, realizing they might be watching the unraveling of a man who had probably intimidated dozens of employees throughout his career. A waiter at the far corner stepped back nervously, almost tripping over a chair leg, while a man in a navy suit seated near the wall who had been observing the scene from the very beginning lifted his hand to his chin, as if evaluating the CEO's every word with quiet calculation, and his focused stare only seemed to deepen the discomfort radiating from the accused executive. "I haven't accused the wrong person," the CEO insisted, though his tone carried more defensiveness than conviction, and his eyes darted toward the pocket where the missing silver pen was supposed to be, almost as if he wasn't entirely sure anymore whether he had truly misplaced it or simply lashed out at the most convenient target available. Evelyn inhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch long enough for the CEO to hear his own uncertainty echo back at him, before responding with a measured cadence that sliced through the silence like a violin bow gliding across a single tense note. "You raised your hand at me," she said, "because you believed I wouldn't stand up for myself, and because you thought no one would question your behavior." And her words rippled through the room like a whispered confession no one wanted to admit they agreed with. The CEO clenched his jaw, visibly irritated at being called out in front of an audience, yet visibly shaken by the fact that Evelyn had not raised her voice or broken down. Instead, she held herself with the quiet strength of someone who had seen far worse indignities in life, and refused to let this one define her. Then, as if sensing the perfect opportunity to puncture the last remnants of the CEO's composure, the man in the navy suit finally spoke up from his table, his tone low but clear enough to reach every ear in the restaurant, saying, "Sir, perhaps you should let her finish before making further accusations." A comment that made several diners stifle gasps or glance sideways in growing anticipation. The CEO shot him a sharp glare, irritated that another patron had dared to interject, yet he visibly hesitated before responding, realizing that the room no longer belonged to him, and the attention he had once considered flattering now felt like a spotlight exposing every crack in his demeanor. Evelyn stepped slightly forward, though not aggressively, simply with the warmth of someone accustomed to de-escalating situations rather than escalating them, and her presence alone seemed to draw the room into an even deeper stillness as she continued. "My father taught me that when someone questions your integrity, you don't shout or strike, you remind them who you are." Her words hung in the air like a suspended cord, and the CEO swallowed hard, his shoulders stiffening, as that statement forced him to confront the possibility that she belonged to a world far larger than the one he had reduced her to with his careless accusation. Slowly, she reached into the small pocket of her apron, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to make the CEO's eyes widen in preemptive alarm, and she retrieved a simple phone, placing it on the white tablecloth beside her with the same deliberate intention she showed toward every task she performed in the restaurant. "I can call him," she said quietly, "but I don't think you want that. Not if you understand the consequences." And her voice remained steady, though the weight behind each syllable made the CEO's expression shift from arrogance to something closer to fear, and several diners inhaled softly as they watched a man accustomed to commanding rooms now struggling to control his own breathing. Across the dining hall, the piano player who had frozen earlier hesitated with his fingers hovering above the keys, unsure whether to resume or stay still, and ultimately decided against touching the instrument, as if even music understood that interrupting this moment would be inappropriate. The CEO exhaled shakily, realizing he had reached a crossroads where pride might cost him far more than he originally imagined, and with each passing second, more guests shifted their attention fully toward Evelyn, sensing her rising strength rather than her supposed vulnerability. "I didn't mean to," the CEO began, but Evelyn gently lifted her hand, stopping his words with a gesture so subtle and mature that it felt like something only a woman who had lived a long, complicated life could deliver with such grace. "You meant it," she answered, "because it was easy," and her voice carried the unmistakable tone of truth, a truth so simple and direct that not even the CEO could argue without exposing himself further. The man in the navy suit leaned back slightly, nodding with a faint expression of respect, while two other guests whispered faintly about how humility seemed to be the only path the CEO had left if he wanted any chance at restoring his reputation that evening. Evelyn stood still, breathing calmly as she faced him, and the entire room felt suspended in anticipation, waiting to see whether the powerful man would choose honesty or stubbornness, redemption or further humiliation, and the CEO finally lowered his gaze, understanding that he no longer possessed the upper hand in any sense of the word. "Then, perhaps," Evelyn concluded softly, "it's time to decide what kind of man you want to be from here on out." And the gravity of her words settled into the room with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any punishment, leaving the CEO motionless as the silent judgment of the restaurant gathered around him like a tide he could no longer push back. The room stayed painfully silent as the CEO lowered his gaze, yet Evelyn remained completely composed, her posture steady and deliberate, carrying an unspoken dignity that seemed to draw every pair of eyes toward her with a quiet gravitational pull that even the most powerful men in the room could not escape. Although the confrontation still lingered in the air like a storm cloud, Evelyn's thoughts drifted for a moment toward the life waiting for her outside the restaurant, and the contrast between her public poise and private struggles settled gently over her like a familiar weight she had learned to carry with patience rather than bitterness. She remembered waking up that morning in her tiny Queens apartment, where the old radiator clicked endlessly through the cold dawn hours and the thin curtains fluttered in the draft that never quite went away, reminding her that comfort had always been a luxury she learned not to expect. The kitchen smelled faintly of instant coffee and the lavender cleaner she used every night, and the mismatched dishes stacked by the sink whispered stories of decades spent budgeting every dollar with discipline meant to stretch paychecks further than anyone should ever need to stretch them. Her morning ritual included a quiet moment at the small wooden table she inherited from her mother, where she wrote reminders to pick up her medication and check on her grandson after school, and these simple, grounding tasks made her feel anchored despite how tumultuous life sometimes felt. She had worked in restaurants since she was 17, scrubbing pots in diners, wiping counters in small family cafes, and eventually learning to navigate upscale dining rooms where wealthy guests rarely looked twice at the people serving them, yet she had never allowed the lack of recognition to shrink the kindness she offered freely. Before every shift, she polished her shoes carefully, straightened the collar of her white blouse, and tied her apron with a precision that reflected her pride in small details, because she believed that respect often began with how one presented themselves, even when no one else seemed to care. Her coworkers admired her calm presence, and many quietly sought her advice when schedules became overwhelming or personal problems spilled into work, trusting her because she never judged, never rushed, and always listened as if every word mattered deeply. Despite her calm demeanor, Evelyn's health had become increasingly difficult to manage in recent years, and the medication she took each morning sometimes made her dizzy during long shifts, yet she pushed through the discomfort because she refused to burden her children with bills they couldn't afford. Her eldest son Daniel called her every Sunday asking whether she needed help, but she always reassured him that she was managing, even when overtime shifts left her knees aching and her breathing unsteady by the time she reached her apartment's creaky elevator. She didn't talk about her worries with others, choosing instead to pour her hope into her grandson Marcus, whose wide smile and endless curiosity reminded her of the dreams she once held before life had taught her to navigate adversity with resilience rather than regret. The CEO standing before her now knew none of these things, and perhaps that was why he had chosen her as an easy target, assuming that quiet meant weak and age meant powerless, forgetting that true strength often grows in silence rather than in noise. Evelyn studied his face carefully, sensing the conflict beneath his stiff posture, and in that moment she recognized the unmistakable look of a man who had never been confronted by someone he underestimated, and the realization unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. The diners observing from nearby tables shifted slightly, some leaning forward with empathy, others with curiosity, and a few with the quiet awareness that this moment was less about a missing pen and more about the revelation of character in a man who believed he controlled every room he entered. Yet Evelyn did not revel in his discomfort because she knew from her long life that humiliation rarely changed people, but accountability sometimes did, and she understood that offering a path to dignity could teach a lesson far more effectively than offering a path to disgrace. "People deserve the benefit of being heard before being judged," she said gently, her words woven with the softness of someone who had forgiven much throughout her lifetime, even when forgiveness felt difficult. And the sincerity of her tone made the CEO shift uneasily as her message landed more deeply than he expected. Her breathing steadied as she allowed the room's tension to settle, and for a brief moment she could almost feel the restaurant fading away behind her, replaced by the quiet memory of preparing breakfast for her grandson before school and kissing the top of his head while imagining a brighter future for him. The CEO's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the burden of his own choices had finally begun pressing into him with a weight he could no longer ignore, and the murmured breaths from the guests suggested that they, too, felt the shift toward something more human and less adversarial. Evelyn, sensing an opening for grace rather than retribution, softened her expression just enough to allow the moment to breathe, reminding herself that power was fleeting and pride was fragile, but compassion, when used wisely, could sculpt a permanent change in even the most rigid lives. She stepped back slowly, giving the CEO space without relinquishing her integrity, and the dining room seemed to exhale as one collective body, as if acknowledging that the storm had passed, but the lesson remained carved into the walls, lingering with quiet significance. In that lingering silence, Evelyn realized that her strength did not come from the name she carried or the threat she could use, but from the lifetime of kindness and endurance that had shaped her, and for the first time that evening, the CEO began to understand that truth as well, standing before her not as a man of wealth, but as a man suddenly aware of his own flaws. Evelyn held his gaze for a few seconds longer, then turned toward the table she had abandoned earlier, ready to continue her shift with the dignity she always carried, unaware that the night was far from over, and that the next chapter would bring an unexpected visitor who would change everything once again. As Evelyn returned to the service station with slow, measured steps, the dining room gradually resumed a faint hum of conversation, yet every glance that flickered across the tables carried the same lingering tension, as though the guests sensed that the confrontation had not truly ended but merely shifted into a quieter phase, demanding even closer attention. The CEO stood exactly where she had left him, still unsettled by the realization that his authority no longer held the effortless dominance he was accustomed to, and his eyes darted repeatedly toward the entrance, as though he feared someone might walk in who could tilt the night even further out of his control. The man in the navy suit, who had observed with unwavering focus since the beginning, placed his napkin down with deliberate precision, his expression thoughtful and unreadable, giving the impression of someone accustomed to assessing volatile situations with a calm intelligence that carried far more influence than he bothered to display openly. He leaned slightly toward the older gentleman seated across from him, whispering something that made the man straighten his back and glance subtly toward the frazzled CEO, and within seconds, a quiet ripple of curiosity passed through nearby tables as several diners tried to determine whether these two men were bystanders or something far more significant. Evelyn continued wiping down a tray even though it was already spotless, using the simple motion to steady her thoughts as she considered how quickly moments of conflict could expose the fragile underpinnings of power, and she reminded herself that rising above cruelty did not require shouting, but rather choosing a path that honored her own sense of dignity. Before she could fully reorient herself, the maitre d' hurried toward her with a strained smile, lowering his voice to a whisper that carried a subtle tremor, explaining that a very important reservation had just arrived unannounced and was requesting a discreet table, and he looked at her with pleading eyes that suggested he desperately hoped she would be the one to manage it. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility tightening around her tired shoulders, and she nodded without hesitation because she knew that stepping forward during the most critical moments was what she had always done, not out of ambition, but out of a deeply ingrained instinct to protect her coworkers from unnecessary pressure. The maitre d' straightened his jacket, hurried toward the entrance, and bowed slightly to greet the incoming guest, and when the tall, silver-haired man stepped into the warm glow of the chandelier light, a hush swept across half the dining room, as though every person recognized the unmistakable presence of someone whose reputation preceded him by several miles. He carried himself with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself through volume or aggression, and his subtle nod to the staff suggested a familiar respect for hard-working people that contrasted sharply with the entitlement displayed moments earlier by the CEO still lingering awkwardly near the center of the room. As the older gentleman walked further in, his gaze swept calmly across the restaurant, and when his eyes landed on the man in the navy suit, the two exchanged a brief acknowledgement that felt more like a silent conversation than a simple greeting, leaving nearby guests buzzing with subtle excitement at the possibility that something important was unfolding. The CEO noticed the entrance as well, and the way his posture stiffened betrayed a sudden spike of anxiety, as though he recognized the newcomer not merely as another high-profile guest, but as someone whose opinion could carry severe consequences for his already damaged reputation. Evelyn felt the shift immediately, sensing that the energy in the room had tightened like a drawn bowstring, and she stepped slightly aside to allow the maitre d' to lead the distinguished guest toward a private booth, although the man paused midway and turned his head with a curious look that landed directly on the shaken CEO. "What happened here?" the older gentleman asked quietly, speaking not to anyone in particular, yet eliciting immediate reactions from several tables. And the CEO swallowed hard as though he wished desperately that the question had come from anyone else in the world. The man in the navy suit stood slowly, smoothing his jacket with the kind of calm control that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, and he approached the newcomer with an air of practiced professionalism, leaning in to offer a short explanation that made the older gentleman's eyebrows lift in measured disbelief. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained respectfully still, knowing that speaking out of turn would not only break protocol, but also risk escalating the situation further, and she reminded herself that patience was often the most powerful form of self-control in rooms where status determined the weight of every word. The older gentleman turned his gaze toward her with unexpected gentleness, and although he had not yet asked her for her version of events, there was a depth to his eyes that suggested he recognized integrity when he saw it, as if he understood that the calm she carried was not a performance, but something forged through experience and principle. Without raising his voice, he addressed the CEO with a tone that held far more authority than anger ever could, saying, "I hope whatever occurred here can be resolved with honesty, because tonight is not a night for arrogance." And the CEO's uneasy shift confirmed that the message had struck its intended mark. Guests leaned subtly toward each other, whispering guesses about the newcomer's identity and speculating whether he might be a board chairman, a major investor, or perhaps someone with familial ties to a much larger legacy. And the air filled with the kind of electric curiosity that made even simple movements feel charged with meaning. Evelyn met the gentleman's eyes for a brief second, sensing a strange but comforting familiarity in his quiet confidence, and though she did not speak, the respectful nod he offered in return felt like a small acknowledgment that her strength had not gone unnoticed. As the two men stepped aside to discuss the unfolding conflict, the CEO's demeanor transformed from defensive bluster to uneasy compliance, revealing the unmistakable truth that whatever influence he thought he carried had just been overshadowed by someone far more significant, and the restaurant collectively realized that the balance of power had shifted once again. Evelyn steadied her breath, preparing herself for whatever came next, because she understood that the night was approaching a turning point, and whatever truth would be revealed soon had the potential to reshape everything that had unfolded so far. The older gentleman stood quietly beside the maitre d', listening to the hushed explanation offered by the man in the navy suit, and although his expression remained controlled, the subtle tightening around his eyes suggested he grasped instantly that the situation involved far more than a simple misunderstanding about a missing pen. Evelyn sensed the gravity in his gaze as it shifted again toward the nervous CEO, who now looked as though he were standing in a courtroom rather than a luxury dining room, and the weight of the moment made several guests instinctively lower their voices, recognizing that a deeper truth was beginning to edge into the space between them. The CEO attempted a stiff smile that wilted almost immediately under the older gentleman's steady scrutiny, and he cleared his throat with a forced casualness that fooled no one, saying, "I believe there was a small error in communication tonight. Nothing more," though the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear simmering beneath the surface. The older gentleman did not respond immediately, choosing instead to study him with the kind of deliberate patience that only men who had spent decades navigating high-level negotiations possessed, and the silence that followed felt so dense it nearly pressed against the walls themselves. Then, with a voice calm enough to unsettle the already rattled CEO, he asked, "And was it this employee?" gesturing subtly toward Evelyn, "who was responsible for entertaining your accusations without being allowed to defend herself?" And his question flowed through the room like a quiet thunderclap, steady and inevitable. The CEO swallowed hard, glanced toward Evelyn, and then glanced away just as quickly, appearing painfully aware that every pair of eyes in the restaurant now expected honesty, even though truth had never been his preferred currency in uncomfortable situations. Before he could gather a coherent response, a second server hesitantly approached the maitre d', with a small, trembling hand holding something metallic wrapped in a napkin, and the maitre d's eyes widened as he carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal the very silver pen the CEO had accused Evelyn of stealing earlier. A murmur rippled through the room as the maitre d' held it up, explaining in a strained whisper that it had been discovered beneath the CEO's coat on the back of his own chair, and this revelation washed over the restaurant like a sudden drop in temperature, freezing every conversation mid-syllable. The CEO's face drained of color as the evidence hovered before him, and his instinctive attempt to reach for the pen only deepened the impression that he had tried desperately to maintain control of a situation built entirely on a false assumption, shifting the narrative irreversibly against him. The older gentleman turned his head slightly, seeing the scene unfold with a level of disappointment far more potent than anger, and he asked in a low, firm tone, "Did you accuse this woman without checking your own belongings first?" with a cadence that suggested he already knew the answer. The CEO stammered something about confusion and long work hours, but his attempt at justification faltered immediately as the older gentleman held up a hand, silencing him with an authority that came not from volume, but from reputation, presence, and decades of leadership that required no theatrics. Evelyn remained still during the entire revelation, her fingers gently resting against the service station countertop, and although she felt a subtle ache behind her ribs from the stress of the confrontation, she kept her posture steady because she refused to give the moment more turmoil than it already held. The man in the navy suit stepped forward slightly, revealing a sharper edge to his demeanor as he addressed the CEO with a calm severity, noting that the restaurant's surveillance system had likely documented the entire sequence of events, and the certainty in his tone caused the CEO to stiffen with visible dread. Guests exchanged glances filled with astonishment as they realized the CEO's earlier aggression now appeared not merely impulsive, but recklessly baseless, and whispers of disbelief swept through the restaurant like a soft wind carrying judgment in every direction. The older gentleman shifted his weight and looked at the maître d', instructing him to retrieve the manager immediately, and the quiet authority in his command made the CEO flinch as though the walls of the restaurant were inching closer with every passing second. He then turned toward Evelyn, offering a nod of recognition that felt both respectful and apologetic without needing any explicit words, and she responded with a faint bow of her head, not to claim victory but to acknowledge a moment of long-overdue fairness in a world that often denied such things to people like her. Yet beneath the surface of this vindication, a deeper tension began to rise, as the older gentleman's gaze sharpened when he noticed the subtle tremble in the CEO's hands, an involuntary reaction that hinted at more than mere embarrassment, suggesting guilt, fear, or consequences looming far beyond the confines of that dining room. He stepped closer and spoke quietly, though his tone carried the unmistakable gravity of someone who had seen men unravel from lies far smaller than this, saying, "I hope you understand that accusing an innocent woman is not simply discourteous, it exposes something dangerous about your judgment," and the CEO's expression darkened under the weight of the rebuke. The air thickened as the older gentleman's words settled, and several diners leaned back in their seats with the uneasy realization that this confrontation had not been about a pen, nor even entirely about pride, but about an unraveling pattern of behavior that hinted at something far more troubling beneath the CEO's polished exterior. Evelyn watched the CEO closely, noticing a flicker of panic behind his eyes, as though he feared not only public embarrassment, but also the exposure of secrets he had worked tirelessly to keep hidden, and she sensed intuitively that the missing pen was merely the spark that ignited a much larger fire. The older gentleman exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering as he delivered the line that sent a visible jolt through the CEO's stiff frame. "This isn't the first time, is it?" And the question, laden with implication, slid into the silence like a blade of truth, demanding a reckoning he could no longer outrun. The CEO's face drained further when the older gentleman asked whether this was truly his first offense, and the question hung in the thick silence like a slowly descending verdict, carrying with it the unmistakable implication that his behavior had stirred suspicions long before tonight's unraveling confrontation. He attempted to speak, but his voice caught in his throat as he noticed several diners watching him with a sudden clarity that pierced deeper than mere curiosity, and for the first time he seemed to realize that the room no longer feared his authority, but instead braced for whatever truth might surface next. The older gentleman stepped closer with a calmness more intimidating than anger, stating that genuine leaders never resorted to intimidation when their pride felt threatened, and the measured cadence of his words made the CEO shrink back slightly, as though each syllable peeled away a layer of his carefully constructed facade. Evelyn stood quietly near the service station, not interfering and not retreating, simply holding the same steady presence she had shown from the very beginning, and her calm endurance contrasted so sharply with the CEO's unraveling composure that several guests exchanged glances filled with unmistakable admiration. The maître d' returned with the restaurant manager, who approached the gathering with a tense mixture of urgency and caution, clearly aware that the situation now involved more than a single guest complaint and might soon escalate into something with far-reaching consequences for the establishment's reputation. The manager listened as the older gentleman calmly explained that the accusation had been unfounded and that the missing pen had been discovered beneath the CEO's own coat, and every word seemed to chip away another piece of the CEO's stiffness until he looked less like an executive and more like a cornered man staring into an uncomfortable truth. Several diners whispered softly as they pieced together the sequence of events, and one woman shook her head in disapproval, remarking under her breath that people in power often revealed their true character only when circumstances forced them out of the spotlight they controlled so carefully. The CEO's eyes darted around the room, landing momentarily on the man in the navy suit who had observed everything with unwavering attention, and there was a flicker of silent recognition between them, suggesting a history neither wished to acknowledge, but both could no longer avoid confronting. Desperation began creeping into the CEO's posture as he tried to muster an explanation, insisting that stress had clouded his judgment and that he had not intended to accuse Evelyn so harshly. Yet even he seemed unconvinced by the thin excuses spilling awkwardly from his tightening lips. The manager cleared his throat politely but firmly, explaining that the restaurant took accusations against staff extremely seriously, especially when directed at long-term employees known for their integrity, and he emphasized that such behavior jeopardized not only the dignity of the workers, but also the trust between guests and the establishment itself. The CEO attempted a tight smile that collapsed immediately when the older gentleman added that patterns of aggression rarely stemmed from a single moment, and the weight of that observation caused the CEO to stiffen as though he feared that someone might reveal other instances he had hoped would remain hidden in the shadows of private boardrooms. Evelyn felt a subtle ache in her chest as she watched the scene unfold, not out of sympathy for the CEO, but from a familiar understanding that humiliation rarely softened hardened hearts, and she reminded herself that fairness mattered more than revenge, even when justice came wrapped in public accountability. A guest at a nearby table finally spoke up, her voice steady and resolute as she stated that she had seen the CEO lash out earlier, and another guest added that his dismissive tone toward the staff had been noticeable from the moment he arrived, prompting a murmur of agreement from several others who had remained silent until now. The CEO's jaw tightened as the faint murmurs grew into a subtle but undeniable wave of collective judgment, and he found himself standing not merely before Evelyn and the older gentleman, but before an entire room that now served as an impromptu tribunal, weighing his actions with unfiltered honesty. The man in the navy suit took a slow breath, then stepped forward with the composed authority of someone unafraid to speak the truth aloud, saying that leadership required self-control and humility, and that a man who allowed frustration to turn into aggression revealed far more about his weaknesses than his strength. The CEO's gaze faltered again, and for a moment he looked like a man grappling with the sudden realization that his power had always depended on the perception of competence, which had now fractured beneath the silent scrutiny of people who no longer viewed him with the reverence he expected. The older gentleman raised a hand gently, signaling for everyone to quiet, and then he addressed the CEO with a firm yet controlled voice, explaining that the measure of a person's character was reflected not in their achievements, but in how they treated those they believed they could overpower without consequence. Guests nodded subtly as the truth of his words resonated through the room, and the CEO swallowed deeply, understanding that his reputation had suffered a blow far more damaging than any corporate controversy, because the judgment of ordinary people often echoed louder than official reports or polished press statements. Evelyn watched all of this unfold with a steady calm, her expression neither triumphant nor bitter, because she understood that tonight's confrontation was merely one chapter in a lifetime of experiences that had taught her to rise above cruelty with dignity rather than anger, even when standing before someone who had attempted to diminish her without reason. The CEO finally lowered his head with a defeated exhale, grasping that he had been exposed not by accusations or documents, but by the simple truth revealed through his own actions, and as the restaurant settled into a heavy stillness, it became clear that the room now waited for the next inevitable shift in this unfolding reckoning, one that would determine whether the CEO would seek redemption or continue down a path shaped by pride and fear. Evelyn stood quietly as the room's heavy silence settled again, and every guest seemed to sense that although the CEO had been publicly confronted, the moment of true reckoning had not yet arrived, because the next words spoken would determine whether the night ended with humiliation or transformation. She stepped forward with a calm deliberateness that contrasted starkly with the CEO's trembling posture, and her voice, though soft, carried effortlessly across the room with a kind of clarity that made even the most distracted diner lift their head to listen. "Sir, she began gently. "You assumed I was powerless because I served tables rather than sit at them." And her words unfurled through the dining hall like a slow, precise ribbon of truth that wrapped around the CEO's fractured confidence with gentle but unbreakable tension. He lifted his eyes toward her, startled not by anger but by the composed dignity she wore like armor, and the subtle tremor in his jaw revealed that her calmness unnerved him far more deeply than the older gentleman's stern reprimand. Evelyn continued, explaining that respect could not be demanded through intimidation, but earned through decency and humility, and her voice carried the weight of lived experience rather than rhetorical moralizing, which made the CEO's posture shrink, as though her words pressed directly against the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. The older gentleman and the man in the navy suit exchanged a brief glance, recognizing that Evelyn had stepped into a position of moral authority with remarkable ease, and their silent acknowledgment carried a sense of admiration that made several nearby diners nod in agreement. The CEO attempted to speak, insisting weakly that he had never meant to harm anyone. Yet his voice faltered again, when Evelyn gently raised her hand and asked, "Then why did you raise your hand at all, if your intention was kindness?" And the question struck the room with such precision that several guests inhaled quietly in collective disbelief. Her tone remained steady rather than accusatory, but the honesty embedded in her words cut deeper than any outburst could have, forcing the CEO to confront the uncomfortable truth that his behavior had stemmed not from stress, but from a deeply ingrained habit of asserting dominance whenever his control felt threatened. The maitre d' watched anxiously, clasping his hands behind his back as though bracing for another escalation, yet even he seemed to realize that Evelyn was not seeking vengeance but clarity, and the room leaned subtly forward as though anticipating another sentence that would shift the night in yet another unexpected direction. The CEO's shoulders sagged as he attempted to piece together an explanation, but Evelyn spoke again before he could respond, saying, "People show who they are when no one is watching, but tonight you showed yourself in front of an entire room." And the stark honesty of her statement sent a soft murmur across the dining hall. His eyes widened slightly, as though he had not expected such measured precision from someone he had so quickly dismissed earlier, and the realization that he had misjudged her so profoundly etched a visible strain across his expression that even the distant tables could see. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice becoming even softer, which paradoxically made her words carry more force, and she added, "You thought I would break because you believed I had no one to stand behind me, but strength doesn't come from position, it comes from integrity." "Oh." The older gentleman nodded almost imperceptibly at her words, recognizing the truth woven through them, and the diners exchanged glances that reflected a growing awareness that they were witnessing not merely a confrontation, but a shift in the balance of moral power within the room. The CEO opened his mouth as if to argue, but the man in the navy suit spoke first, stating calmly that arrogance often blinded people to their own vulnerabilities, and his voice carried the crisp certainty of someone accustomed to interpreting human behavior with exacting precision. Evelyn's gaze softened for a brief moment, and she added with quiet empathy, "It takes courage to admit when you are wrong, but it takes even more courage to change after doing so." And her gentle sincerity made the CEO's eyes flick downward, unable to hold her gaze under such transparent honesty. The manager approached cautiously, asking whether Evelyn wished to file a formal complaint against the CEO. But she shook her head slowly, explaining that her intention had never been to punish him, but to remind him of the responsibility that came with influence, and her refusal to seek retribution caused several guests to whisper in admiration. Her restraint seemed to affect the older gentleman as well, and he stepped forward with visible respect, telling her that true leadership was reflected not in exerting power, but in knowing when to wield compassion, and his tone carried a conviction that made the CEO flinch again, as though the words struck a tender nerve. The CEO's breathing grew uneven as he looked between Evelyn and the older gentleman, realizing that the room was no longer evaluating whether he had erred, but whether he possessed the character to acknowledge his mistakes and grow from them. and the weight of that expectation pressed down on him with startling force. Evelyn lowered her gaze slightly, allowing the moment to settle before she delivered the line that would echo through the restaurant long after the evening ended. "Before you ask others to respect your position, learn to respect the humanity in the people who serve you." And her words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. The CEO's expression tightened with a painful mix of embarrassment and dawning self-awareness as the diners absorbed her message, and the air in the room shifted subtly as though the moral center had tilted toward her, leaving him exposed in a way he had never expected. For several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound came from the faint clinking of distant silverware. As diners attempted to process the quiet power Evelyn carried with such unassuming grace, and the CEO finally understood that the foundation of authority was not fear but trust, something he had just learned through the steady, unwavering strength of a woman he had once believed he could easily silence. The room's silence deepened after Evelyn delivered her final sentence, and the weight of her words seemed to ripple outward like a slow-moving wave that touched every table before settling over the entire restaurant with an almost spellbinding intensity. Several diners exchanged quiet glances, each look carrying its own unspoken judgment, and the subtle shift in their expressions revealed a collective realization that the confrontation had grown far beyond a simple conflict between a guest and an employee, transforming instead into a moment that peeled back the veneer of power and exposed the truth beneath it. The woman seated nearest the windows leaned forward with her elbows resting gently against the table's edge, whispering to her companion that she had never witnessed someone maintain such poise under pressure, and her companion nodded in solemn agreement as his gaze drifted toward the visibly shaken CEO. The sound of a fork clattering softly in the distance reminded everyone that life in the restaurant still existed beyond this gathering tension. Yet no one returned fully to their meals, choosing instead to remain anchored in the gravity of the unfolding reckoning that held their rapt attention. The CEO's breathing grew more uneven as he sensed the collective shift around him, and the sudden awareness that every whispered conversation likely revolved around his behavior seeped into his posture with a heaviness that caused his shoulders to draw inward like a man bracing against an invisible storm. He turned his gaze toward the exit for a brief moment, as if contemplating whether he should escape before the night swallowed him whole, but the presence of the older gentleman standing between him and any imagined refuge served as a quiet reminder that running would not erase the judgment already carved into the room. Evelyn watched him with the same steady calm she had maintained from the beginning, though she could sense the layers of fear, pride, and confusion unraveling inside him, and she understood instinctively that the man before her was facing not just public embarrassment, but an internal fracture that threatened to split open the uncomfortable truth about who he had allowed himself to become. The man in the navy suit stepped closer to the older gentleman, lowering his voice as he asked whether they should intervene more directly, yet the older gentleman raised a hand gently, signaling that the next words belonged not to him but to Evelyn, because her voice had already become the moral center of the evening. A waiter carrying a tray of sparkling water stopped mid-step, watching the CEO with an expression torn between sympathy and disbelief, and even from across the room, Evelyn noticed the faint tremble in the young man's hands, as though witnessing the consequences of unrestrained power had shaken him far more deeply than he expected. The manager cleared his throat softly, attempting to re-establish a sense of order, yet his voice barely carried across the room because every guest seemed more invested in whatever Evelyn might say or do next, recognizing that she had become the quiet catalyst guiding the room toward resolution. Evelyn finally broke the silence, her tone gentler than before yet imbued with an unmistakable firmness, and she explained that integrity was not measured by status or influence, but by behavior during moments when the truth carried consequences, and her words drifted through the room with a resonance that felt almost reverent. A man seated near the bar whispered that Evelyn's grace reminded him of someone raised with discipline and legacy, and his companion leaned forward with sudden curiosity, asking whether she might come from a family more significant than her modest demeanor suggested. igniting a subtle ripple of speculation among several nearby tables. The CEO stiffened when he overheard the murmurs questioning Evelyn's background, and a brief spark of realization flickered across his face as he wondered whether the quiet confidence she carried might stem from a history he had foolishly overlooked, yet the fear of discovering the truth kept him silent. The older gentleman studied Evelyn with a soft, contemplative gaze, clearly recognizing something familiar in her posture and cadence, and when he exchanged a knowing look with the man in the navy suit, several diners caught the silent exchange and wondered aloud whether the two men knew more about her than they intended to reveal. Evelyn sensed the shift as well, but chose not to address it, allowing the room to draw its own conclusions, while she remained focused on guiding the CEO toward accountability, because she understood that genuine remorse could only arise when a person faced the full weight of their own actions without distraction or denial. The CEO's voice cracked when he finally attempted to speak, explaining with strained sincerity that he had been under immense pressure at work and had allowed that stress to distort his judgment, yet the tremor in his words revealed that he knew his explanation was insufficient to justify the harm he had caused. Evelyn softened her expression ever so slightly, acknowledging that even powerful people struggled under the burden of expectations, yet she reminded him that hardship could never excuse cruelty, especially toward those who lacked the protection of status or influence to defend themselves. A soft gasp rose from a nearby table when the older gentleman stepped closer and addressed the CEO with a tone that carried both disappointment and finality, stating that leadership required emotional intelligence as much as strategic skill, and that any man who failed to recognize this would ultimately sabotage his own authority. The CEO's shoulders slumped beneath the weight of those words, and for the first time he appeared genuinely humbled, as though he finally understood that the path before him demanded something far more difficult than excuses or evasions. It required self-reflection powerful enough to reshape who he might become. Evelyn maintained her steady gaze, reinforcing the truth that transformation could begin only when pride gave way to understanding, and the room remained suspended in a collective breath, waiting to see whether the CEO would accept the responsibility that now stood before him like a fragile but critical invitation to redemption. As the guests leaned subtly closer, drawn into the unfolding moment with quiet anticipation, Evelyn sensed that the next steps would determine not only the CEO's fate, but also whether tonight's confrontation would conclude with reconciliation or fracture, and she steeled herself with the calm certainty that she would guide this moment toward clarity regardless of the outcome. And in that quiet, electrified stillness, the room seemed to lean into her presence, as though awaiting the truth she had not yet revealed. The truth that her name, once spoken aloud, could shift the balance of power in ways no one in the restaurant was prepared for. The faint murmurs rising from scattered tables slowly converged into a single, unmistakable shift in atmosphere, and the CEO felt the weight of 100 eyes turning toward him with a scrutiny he had never experienced in any boardroom, because for the first time in years he stood without the protection of polished titles or corporate influence. Evelyn remained still at the center of that quiet storm, her presence radiating a soft but steady authority that seemed to anchor the room, and the CEO found himself unable to look away from her calm expression, as though some part of him sensed he had overlooked something profoundly important about her since the moment she first approached his table with a glass of sparkling water. The older gentleman watched them both with a measured restraint that carried more influence than any raised voice could have, and the man in the navy suit leaned closer to whisper something barely audible, yet the CEO noticed the subtle nod the older gentleman gave in response, and the gesture made a cold prickle race down the back of his neck. He swallowed and shifted his stance awkwardly, feeling the tension coil around his ribs like a tightening band, because the room no longer viewed him as a man temporarily overwhelmed by stress, but rather as someone standing on the precipice of a truth he had desperately hoped would never surface. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly and asked whether he understood why the room reacted so strongly to his behavior, and her voice carried a simple clarity that made the CEO instinctively straighten his posture, as though preparing for a verdict he no longer believed he could evade. He opened his mouth, Yet before he could shape a coherent response, the older gentleman stepped closer with the deliberate calm of someone who understood the power of timing, and he stated that people often reveal their true character under pressure, though only a few possess the courage to face the consequences of what those revelations expose. Several diners leaned into the conversation, their movements subtle but unified, creating an almost tidal pull toward the quiet center of the room where Evelyn stood, and the CEO sensed that every whispered suspicion now circled around one unsettling question: who exactly was she? Evelyn didn't answer that question directly, but the honesty in her expression suggested she knew the room had begun connecting dots that were never meant to remain scattered, and the flicker of recognition in the older gentleman's eyes hinted that he had long suspected her identity, but had simply waited for the right moment to confirm it publicly. The CEO took a small step backward, instinctively distancing himself from the truth he felt creeping toward him, and the manager exchanged uneasy glances with the maitre d', both realizing that the situation had evolved far beyond their capacity to manage, yet neither dared to interrupt what felt like an unfolding revelation with consequences they could not begin to predict. Evelyn folded her hands gently in front of her apron, and she explained that life had taught her the value of staying grounded, regardless of circumstance, and the CEO felt something tighten in his chest as he realized her poise was not an act of defiance, but a reflection of a deeply rooted strength he had underestimated from the moment they met. The older gentleman asked her whether she wished to speak further about her background, and she offered a faint smile that held both kindness and mystery, responding that identity mattered far less than integrity, although her answer carried an undertone of truth so unmistakable that several diners straightened in their seats, anticipating a revelation that drifted just beyond their reach. The CEO stared at her with growing confusion, because her words seemed too precise, too steady, and too familiar in cadence to belong to someone who had spent her life entirely removed from influence, and a sudden memory flickered in his mind, an old statement he had once read from a prominent figure known for his unwavering principles. His breath caught as he realized Evelyn's phrasing almost mirrored a line he remembered from a respected business pioneer, someone whose legacy carried enormous weight across the city, and he felt a wave of dread crash over him as the older gentleman's gaze locked with his in a silent acknowledgment that the truth now hovered dangerously close. The man in the navy suit tilted his head as though analyzing the CEO's reaction, and the CEO attempted to mask his growing panic, yet the tremor in his hands betrayed him almost instantly, drawing the attention of several guests who now whispered quietly behind raised menus, their curiosity intensifying as they sensed something monumental approaching. Evelyn stepped slightly closer, her voice still soft but carrying a decisive firmness, and she explained that she had learned long ago never to rely on titles or introductions to earn respect, because genuine character revealed itself most clearly in moments when one's power or reputation offered no shield. Her words resonated through the room with the slow, echoing weight of a distant bell, and the CEO felt heat rising behind his collar as the subtle implication pushed itself into his awareness. This woman, who appeared so unassuming in her uniform, spoke with the clarity and conviction of someone raised in proximity to true leadership. The older gentleman lowered his voice and stated that humility often distinguished those who led with wisdom from those who merely held authority, and the CEO felt the ground shift beneath him, as he wondered whether Evelyn's father might be someone whose approval he had once fought desperately to secure. The murmurs intensified when the man by the bar remarked that Evelyn bore a striking composure similar to a well-known philanthropist whose values shaped several influential organizations, and the suggestion spread quickly through the room, weaving itself into a growing tapestry of speculation that drew every pair of eyes toward her with a mixture of awe and anticipation. The CEO's breathing became shallow as the possibilities churned through his thoughts, and he finally stammered out a hesitant question, asking Evelyn whether her father held any connection to the city's philanthropic circles, but his voice trembled so visibly that the room fell silent in expectation of her reply. Evelyn didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to study him with a gentle patience that carried far more strength than any reprimand, and after a long, steady pause, she responded with a single sentence that made the CEO's knees nearly buckle beneath him. "My father taught me that power means nothing without compassion." Oh. The sentence itself was simple, yet the phrasing carried such unmistakable familiarity that the CEO's eyes widened in horror, because he had heard that exact line quoted in countless interviews, speeches, and board meetings from one of the most respected and influential leaders in the entire state, a man he had spent years trying to impress. And as Evelyn turned her gaze toward him with quiet certainty, the truth he had tried so desperately to avoid finally settled over him with crushing clarity, forcing him to confront the unmistakable reality that the woman he had attempted to belittle tonight was the daughter of a man whose name alone could reshape the entire trajectory of his career. A heavy stillness spread across the dining room after Evelyn's final sentence, and the tremor that passed through the CEO's expression revealed that he recognized the familiar cadence of her words far sooner than he wished, because he knew exactly whose voice she echoed, and the realization struck him with the force of a cold storm crashing against unprepared shores. Before the room had time to even process the weight of that revelation, the maitre d' hurried toward the entrance with a frantic but deferential urgency, and every diner instinctively turned their head as the doors opened to reveal a tall, silver-haired man stepping into the warm glow of the chandeliers with the kind of quiet authority that made conversations die mid-breath. He moved with a calm, steady confidence shaped by years of commanding attention without ever needing to raise his voice, and the respectful bow the staff offered him confirmed what several guests had already begun to suspect, that this was not simply another influential customer, but a man whose presence reshaped the entire balance of the room. The CEO's knees weakened the moment he recognized the newcomer, because this was the one person whose judgment he had feared since the earliest days of his career, a man whose values shaped major philanthropic institutions, and whose integrity stood as a standard many executives failed to reach, yet still attempted to emulate out of sheer admiration. The older gentleman walked farther into the restaurant with deliberate composure, and the murmurs rising among the tables faded into an almost reverent hush as his eyes swept across the dining hall before finally landing on Evelyn with a warmth so unmistakably paternal that the remaining doubts evaporated instantly. "Evelyn," he said softly, and the way her name shaped itself through his gentle voice struck the room with a clarity that confirmed everything the CEO had tried so desperately to deny, because this was her father, the very man she had subtly invoked without threat, without arrogance, and without ever leaning on his name for protection. The CEO staggered back a half-step, feeling the floor tilt beneath him as though the world had narrowed into a single, inescapable truth. He had attempted to intimidate the daughter of a man whose influence quietly shaped countless decisions in industries far beyond the walls of this restaurant. Evelyn bowed her head respectfully, not out of fear, but out of the deep affection reserved for someone who had raised her with compassion rather than privilege, and her father stepped closer to hold her arm, with a tenderness that melted even the stern expressions of several guests, who had remained coldly captivated by the confrontation. The older gentleman turned toward the CEO with an expression that combined disappointment, concern, and a measured restraint forged through decades of leadership, and his voice, although quiet, carried enough gravity to make the CEO's throat tighten painfully as he prepared for the inevitable reckoning. "I was told there was an incident," he said calmly, and the diners who overheard those words felt a chill run through the room because the tone carried no anger, only the devastating steadiness of someone who expected honesty and would not accept anything less. The CEO attempted to speak, stumbling over an apology that collapsed before reaching coherence, because standing before this man stripped him of every scripted justification he once relied on, leaving only the raw truth of his misplaced arrogance and uncontrolled frustration. Evelyn's father listened silently, allowing the CEO's stuttering attempts to hang in the air long enough to expose their emptiness, and then he asked in a measured tone whether there had been any justification for raising a hand against an employee who had shown no disrespect or misconduct. The CEO's face twisted with a mixture of shame and panic, as several diners watched him struggle beneath the question's weight, and he finally whispered that he had made a grave mistake, though the words carried the hollow resonance of someone realizing too late that consequences had already begun to unfold. Evelyn's father glanced briefly at the maitre d', who nodded in quiet confirmation that the missing pen had been found beneath the CEO's own coat, and this detail tightened the tension further, because it underlined how the accusation had been rooted in assumption rather than evidence. The older gentleman exhaled deeply, shaking his head in a gesture that conveyed profound disappointment, and he told the CEO that leadership demanded far more than sharp suits and decisive words. It required the discipline to treat every person, regardless of role or status, with the same dignity one expected for oneself. The CEO's shoulders crumpled beneath the truth like a structure collapsing after losing its final support beam, and his gaze fell toward the polished floor as if hoping it might offer him a refuge from the humiliation pulsing through the room. Evelyn looked at him with the same calm compassion she had shown throughout the night, and although she did not speak, her silence served as a mirror reflecting everything the CEO wished he could erase from this moment, because he had not only wronged her, but had done so in the presence of her father, whose approval he had once sought so earnestly. Her father shifted his attention back to her with softened eyes, asking gently whether she was hurt or shaken, and she responded with quiet assurance that she was fine, though the dignity in her voice made it painfully clear that she should never have been forced to prove her resilience in such a demeaning situation. The diners leaned in more closely, realizing they were witnessing the rare moment when moral authority eclipsed material power entirely, and the CEO seemed to shrink beneath that realization as he attempted to steady himself, though his trembling hands betrayed how deeply the confrontation had shattered his composure. Evelyn's father finally addressed him with the steady cadence of someone who believed in fairness above punishment, explaining that mistakes could be forgiven when met with sincerity, but repeated patterns of arrogance eroded trust to a point where redemption required more than apology, it demanded change. The CEO nodded frantically, promising that he would make things right. Yet the desperation in his voice made the room fall silent again, because everyone sensed he was no longer trying to save his reputation but rather fighting to salvage a small fragment of dignity from the wreckage of his own behavior. Evelyn's father placed a gentle hand on his daughter's arm and told the manager they would speak further in private before departing. But before turning away, he looked once more at the CEO with a quiet finality that left no room for misinterpretation, reminding him that true leadership began only when pride surrendered to humility. As he guided Evelyn toward the quieter section of the restaurant, the CEO remained frozen in place, feeling the full weight of the evening settle onto his shoulders, and the room watched him with a mixture of judgment and pity, reckoning an occasional performance, and her quiet wisdom struck him with far greater impact than any scolding could have achieved. The older gentleman stepped beside her once more and addressed the CEO with a final piece of guidance, telling him that leadership was not measured by how flawlessly a person operated in comfort, but by how responsibly they acted when confronted with conflict, and the CEO breathed shakily as the truth carved itself deeper into him. He promised that he would address the incident with his board and staff, admitting openly that his behavior did not align with the values he claimed to uphold, and several diners exchanged approving glances as though witnessing a small but meaningful shift in a man who had spent too long hiding behind his title. Evelyn's father placed a hand on the CEO's shoulder, not with affection but with an affirming firmness, telling him that growth only occurred when pride gave way to honesty, and that tonight had offered him an opportunity to choose the kind of leader and the kind of man he wished to be moving forward. The CEO nodded silently, feeling his chest tighten as the weight of the evening finally settled in its full measure, and the diners slowly relaxed as the tension began to lift from the room like a passing storm that had left behind both damage and clarity. And as Evelyn stood beside her father with the quiet certainty of someone who had weathered far greater storms than this, the CEO realized that redemption had begun not with his apology but with her unwavering strength, which had illuminated the path forward more clearly than any reprimand could have, guiding him toward the final, inevitable step he would take next. As the final echoes of tension dissipated across the dining room, a soft quiet settled into the space, carrying with it the unmistakable sense that something meaningful had concluded, and the CEO stood motionless for several seconds as he absorbed the weight of a night that had reshaped his understanding of power more profoundly than any professional setback ever had. He breathed slowly as if relearning how to steady himself, and when he finally lifted his gaze, the polished sheen of corporate arrogance that had once defined him had faded, replaced by a fragile sincerity that revealed a man confronting the uncomfortable truth of his own character with newfound humility. Evelyn watched him only briefly before turning her attention back to her father, whose warm, reassuring presence reminded her that strength came not from status, but from the quiet certainty of knowing who she was, even when the world attempted to underestimate her. Her father squeezed her hand gently, offering a look filled with pride rather than triumph, and his eyes carried the kind of understanding only shared between two people who had built their lives on compassion rather than force, shaping resilience through generosity rather than dominance. The manager thanked Evelyn softly for her composure, promising that the staff would shoulder the remainder of the evening's responsibilities, and although she offered a polite nod in response, she felt a subtle heaviness beneath her ribs, reminding her that she had given more emotional strength tonight than she could comfortably afford. Sensing her exhaustion without needing to ask, her father guided her toward the entrance with a quiet smile, and the diners instinctively stepped aside as she passed, offering subtle gestures of respect that felt sincere rather than performative, acknowledging the dignity she had carried throughout the ordeal. The CEO remained frozen near the center of the room, watching her leave with an expression shaped by regret and clarity, and he realized with a quiet ache that the lesson she had given him without malice, without grandstanding, would linger far longer than any reprimand delivered in a boardroom. When Evelyn crossed the threshold into the cool night air, the city greeted her with the distant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights shimmering across the wet pavement, and the gentle whisper of a breeze that carried the familiar scent of New York after dark, comforting in its simplicity and endlessly alive. She inhaled deeply, letting the tension melt from her shoulders as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and the rhythm of passing taxis and soft footsteps reminded her that the world continued forward with or without conflict, offering her a quiet space to reclaim her peace after the emotional demands of the evening. Her father walked beside her in calm silence, both of them grounded in a shared understanding that justice had unfolded not through force but through truth, and Evelyn felt a small, grateful warmth inside her chest, knowing that she had upheld her values without allowing anger to overshadow compassion. A soft drizzle began to fall, tapping lightly against the pavement, and Evelyn lifted her face toward the cool droplets with a tired but gentle smile, letting the quiet rain wash away the remnants of tension that still clung to her, embracing the serenity that followed a long struggle met with integrity. Behind her, the restaurant's golden lights spilled onto the sidewalk like a final reminder of the night she had endured. But ahead of her stretched a city shimmering with possibility, and she walked forward with steady steps, carrying with her the quiet pride of someone who had faced cruelty with unwavering dignity. And in that soft, rain-soaked moment beneath the New York night, Evelyn understood that justice had not come from the fall of a powerful man, but from the simple affirmation that humanity, when held firmly and gently, could reshape even the harshest encounter into a moment of truth, leaving her free to continue her path with strength, grace, and a heart unshaken.